Historically, courses like this one, and the news media more broadly, have disproportionately focused the bulk of our attention on politics at the national level. In general, as a society, we're far more interested in the political dynamics and policy struggles at the federal level. But increasingly, policymaking is being devolved to the states. In part, this reflects a preference for local government, but equally, it's the result of growing gridlock and dysfunction of politics at the national level. Justice power is divided across three branches at federal level: a legislative, executive, and judicial branch, respectively responsible for making the laws, enforcing the laws, and interpreting the laws. So too are the powers of state governments, divided into three branches. However, the precise structure of these various branches across the states varies. Let's explore some of that variation now, and let's start with the legislative branch. State legislatures across the United States vary in some important ways, reflecting the diverse governance styles and historical traditions of each state. All but one of these states have bicameral legislatures, most often consisting of a lower house called a House of Representatives or State Assembly, and an upper chamber called a Senate. The exception is Nebraska, which has a unicameral legislature. State legislatures also vary in terms of size. New Hampshire's House of Representatives has 400 members, making it one of the largest in the world. The Alaska State Senate, by contrast, has just 20 members. Meanwhile, California has a population about 29 times as large as New Hampshire, but only 80 members in the State Assembly, the lower chamber of the California legislature. This means that while the average district in New Hampshire has just 3,300 people, the average district in California has nearly 500,000 people in it. This is important because it affects the accessibility of representatives to their constituents and the closeness of the connection between the people and their representatives in the state legislatures. There are also some variation in terms of term lengths and term limits across the states. While most state legislatures have 2-year terms in the lower chamber and 4-year terms in the upper chamber, some have shorter or longer terms. For example, members of the lower house in 6 states, including Alabama, Louisiana, and the Dakotas, serve 4-year terms. Meanwhile, senators in Connecticut and New Hampshire serve 2-year terms, the same as members of their state houses. And about 15 states have term limits on state legislators, generally limiting members of the state legislatures to 8 or 12 years, depending upon the state. The length and frequency of legislative sessions across the United States also differs. Some states have full-time legislatures with year-round sessions, while others have part-time legislatures meeting only a few months each year or biennially. Additionally, some states permit the governor or legislative leaders to call special sessions for urgent or specific issues outside of the regular legislative calendar, while others do not. The difference between these two groups generally centers on whether the members of the legislature are considered professional legislatures or citizen legislators. States like California, Michigan, New York, and Pennsylvania have full-time legislatures, and members typically view their roles as their primary occupation, often with salaries and benefits commensurate with full-time work and larger staffs to support their work. By contrast, the majority of states have part-time legislatures. In these states, serving as a state legislator is not considered a full-time job, and lawmakers often have careers outside of their legislative duties, receiving lower pay and having smaller staffs. Legislative sessions in these states are generally shorter, and the overall legislative process is less formalized compared to full-time legislatures. There are also a handful of states like Florida, Illinois, Ohio, and Texas, which have hybrid legislatures, falling somewhere between the two extremes. In these states, legislators may spend a significant portion of the year in session and receive higher compensation than in part-time legislatures, but they still maintain other employment outside of the legislature. The scope of legislative power, especially in relation to the executive branch, varies across the states, affecting how much influence the legislature has over state policies and budgets. The extent of legislative authority in different policy areas like education, health, and transportation can also vary based on state constitutions and laws. Finally, there's also some variation in how states approach legislative redistricting processes. Some states like California use independent commissions, reducing the role of politics in the process. Others center that power in the legislature, while still others use a mix of legislative action and independent panels. There's also variation across the states in terms of the executive branch, though not to the same degree as we saw in the legislative branch. There's a degree of variation across the states in terms of the roles and powers of the governor, the chief executive in every state. For example, while governors typically have the power to veto legislation, the extent of this power varies. Some have a line-item veto or the ability to veto specific parts of a bill, while others may have a limited or no line-item veto power whatsoever. Governors also have varying degrees of authority to appoint state officials and judges. In some states, many appointments are subject to legislative approval, while in others the governor has more unilateral appointment powers. With the exception of New Hampshire and Vermont, where the governor serves a 2-year term, all states have 4-year terms for governors. The majority of states have a 2-term limit for governors, echoing the limitations imposed on the president at the federal level. But about a dozen states do not have term limits at all, permitting governors to serve an unlimited number of terms provided they continue to be re-elected. In many states, a lieutenant governor is the second highest executive official and often assumes the role of the governor in their absence. However, the method of election can vary. In some states, the lieutenant governor is elected on the same ticket as the governor, just as the president and vice president are elected in the United States. But in other states, including California, the two offices are elected separately and can even be held by political rivals or members of opposing parties, creating some interesting political dynamics when that happens. Additionally, the specific duties of lieutenant governors can vary, ranging from presiding over the state senate, serving in a similar capacity as the vice president, to serving on a variety of boards and commissions, to handling whatever duties the governor chooses to assign them. States differ in terms of the number and types of executive offices, with common positions including the Secretary of State, Attorney General, Treasurer, Comptroller or Auditor, and Superintendent of Public Instruction. In some states, these officers are part of the governor's cabinet, while in others they are independently elected and operate with significant autonomy. Further, the method of selecting these officers varies. While many are elected, some are appointed by the governor or selected through other methods, influencing their independence and alignment with the governor's policies. The organization of state cabinets and administrative agencies can differ wildly. Some states have large numbers of specialized agencies and departments, while others have a more consolidated structure. The degree to which the governor can shape these agencies also varies, often depending on their power to appoint agency heads and influence policy direction. Finally, the budgetary authority of the governor varies from state to state. In some states, the governor has significant control over the state budget process, including proposing the budget and making cuts. In others, the legislature plays a more dominant role. The extent of the governor's power in financial matters like managing state debt and overseeing expenditures also varies. Finally, the judicial branch can also vary across states. While all states have a 3-tiered system consisting of trial courts, intermediate appellate courts, and Supreme Courts, the names and functions of these courts can vary. Additionally, states often have different systems of specialized courts like family, probate, or juvenile courts within the system addressing specific types of cases. The judicial selection process varies across states. Some states use a merit-based appointment system where judges are appointed by the governor, often from a list provided by a judicial nominating commission. In others, judges are elected either in partisan or nonpartisan elections with varying term lengths and election frequency. Still others, like California, use a combination of appointment and election, where judges are initially appointed but must then stand for election after a certain period. Unlike the federal system where judges typically have lifetime appointments, state judges often serve fixed terms, usually ranging from 4 to 14 years depending upon the court level and the state. In states with appointed judges, retention elections are sometimes used where voters decide whether or not a judge should remain in office after serving a term. State judiciaries vary dramatically in terms of the level of funding and resources allocated, affecting everything from court facilities to the availability of legal aid services. And finally, it's worth noting that while nearly every state in the country draws on British common law tradition, Louisiana is unique in that its court system draws on the French and Spanish civil law system. In a civil law system, laws are typically more codified, and judges play a role more akin to that of applying the law as written rather than interpreting the law based on precedent. But again, Louisiana is unique in that respect. Regardless of the differences in terms of structure, state governments in the United States hold significant powers and responsibilities, many of which are outlined in their respective state constitutions. Indeed, under Article 10 of the U.S. Constitution, all powers not specifically assigned to the federal government fall to the states. This means that states have primary responsibility for policy across a variety of areas. State governments are typically responsible for the administration of public education systems within their borders, including K-12 education and state university systems. While the federal government provides important sources of funding, for example, through federal student loan programs and aid programs, the state generally takes the lead in most areas, including establishing educational standards, curricula, and graduation requirements, and allocating funding for school districts. States have primary responsibility for ensuring public safety and have broad police powers, which include enforcing laws, protecting property, and maintaining public order. Each state has its own criminal code and is responsible for law enforcement, prosecution, and the administration of justice. They also manage prison systems and correctional facilities. States are responsible for building and maintaining transportation infrastructure, such as roads, bridges, and public transit systems, though the interstate highway system is supported by federal funding paid for through the federal gas tax. Additionally, states are responsible for managing public utilities and public works projects, including water supply and waste management. State governments manage public health systems, including hospitals, mental health services, and public health initiatives, and administer welfare programs such as Medicaid, child welfare services, and assistance to low-income families. States have broad powers over the economy, regulating business operations within their jurisdictions, including licensing, labor laws, and consumer protection. They promote economic development, job creation, and in some cases, engage in international trade relations. State governments have the authority to impose taxes, such as income, sales, and property taxes, to fund their operations. States manage and regulate natural resources, including state parks, forests, and wildlife. They also enforce environmental regulations and policies, often in collaboration with federal agencies like the Environmental Protection Agency. And finally, states also regulate and conduct elections within their borders, including federal, state, and local elections. They are responsible for the broader public administration, including maintaining records such as birth certificates, marriage licenses, and other official documents. But even as they share similar areas of responsibility, one of the interesting things about American federalism is how different states pursue policies in similar areas in very different ways. These policy differences reflect the differing political cultures, economic conditions, demographics, geographies, and the different needs and preferences of state populations. Let's look at a few examples. In the area of healthcare, states have made different decisions regarding the expansion of Medicaid under the Affordable Care Act, with some expanding coverage and others not. As a result, some states provide more expansive healthcare coverage for poorer Americans while others do not. Similarly, state regulations on health insurance markets and mandates vary, leading to differences in coverage options and consumer protections. In general, blue states like California and Illinois tend to have more expansive healthcare coverage than red states like Alabama and Mississippi. There's substantial variation in terms of how states fund public education and what standards they set, leading to differences in per-pupil spending, teacher salaries, and educational outcomes. New York spends the most at about $25,000 per pupil, the highest level in the country, while Utah spends the least at about $8,000 per pupil. California comes in 19th, spending about $14,000 per pupil in 2024, slightly above the U.S. average of $12,600 per student. States differ in terms of drug policy and sentencing laws. For example, 20 states, including California and Colorado, have legalized recreational marijuana, permitting possession and consumption subject to laws very similar to alcohol consumption. In most other states, marijuana is permitted for medical but not recreational use. And in a few states, Idaho, Kansas, Tennessee, and Wyoming, as of 2024, marijuana is still fully illegal. There are also differences in terms of legalization or decriminalization of other drugs. Oregon, for example, has legalized the medical use of psilocybins, mushrooms, and other psychedelics, while a handful of other jurisdictions are considering similar measures. And in the context of criminal justice more broadly, there's significant variation in sentencing laws, with some states imposing mandatory minimums and others focusing on rehabilitation and alternative sentencing. States take varied approaches to environmental policy, especially on questions related to climate change, renewable energy mandates, and fossil fuel extraction. Policies on land use, water rights, and conservation can differ significantly, often based on the natural resources and environmental challenges specific to each state. And in some cases, state policies can have significant impact across the entire country. California, for example, has used its massive market to influence fuel efficiency and safety standards for automobiles purchased across the entire United States. Because California's economy is about 20% of the total U.S. economy, it's often cheaper for producers to use California's more stringent standards for automobiles sold across the entire United States, rather than to create one set of cars for California and another for the rest of the U.S. As a result, California's standards have sometimes become the default standards for the entire country. Labor and employment laws vary across the states. State minimum wage laws vary, with some states having higher minimum wages than the federal standard and others aligning with the federal standard. Similarly, states have different policies on union memberships and dues, affecting labor relations and union strength. States vary in terms of social policies. We see this play out in a number of areas: policies on same-sex marriage prior to federal legalization, anti-discrimination protections, and transgender rights differ dramatically across the states. And following the Supreme Court's Dobbs decision, which overturned Roe v. Wade, abortion laws have increasingly diverged across the country, with some states prohibiting the procedure altogether, others restricting access after a particular point in pregnancy, and still others continuing to protect access. Similarly, gun control policies vary across the states, though courts have increasingly limited the ability of states to impose restrictions on firearms ownership. Nevertheless, there remains considerable variation across the country, with some states like California imposing a variety of regulations in areas like permitting requirements, magazine capacity, open and concealed carry, gun-free zones, and red flag laws, while others adopt more permissive gun laws. Finally, states have adopted a variety of tax structures impacting the level of revenue raised by the states and thus often funding for programs we've previously considered. Some states like Alaska, Florida, Nevada, and Texas do not have state income taxes but rely on sales taxes, property taxes, and other taxes or sources of income to raise state revenue. Others use a flat tax system where all taxpayers are subject to the same tax rate. Others use a flat tax system where all taxpayers are subject to the same. Rely on a more progressive tax system, which taxes those with higher incomes at a higher tax rate than those with lower incomes. Other tax rates can also vary. For example, while Texas does not have an income tax, it does have comparatively high property taxes. California, by contrast, has one of the lowest property tax rates in the country, thanks largely to Proposition 13, which limited the state's ability to income property tax assessments. And sales taxes are often imposed on purchases by both state and local governments. A handful of states, Alaska, Delaware, Montana, New Hampshire, and Oregon, have no state sales tax. In other jurisdictions like Arkansas, Louisiana, and Tennessee, the state sales tax is quite high, often exceeding 10% when state and local rates are combined. California's sales tax rate falls towards the higher end of the spectrum when compared to other states. And we can see these differences reflected in this table. Feel free to pause the video and look more closely if you're interested. There are a host of reasons for the differences in policies we observe. States with different political leanings may prioritize different policy outcomes based on conservative or liberal ideologies. This is one reason why we tend to see more progressive policies in states like California and Illinois than we see in states like Alabama and Mississippi. The strength and focus of interest groups can shape policy agendas. Environmental groups, for example, are far more influential in California, while the oil and gas industry are more influential in Texas. As a result, we would expect to see state policies in these areas diverge between the two states. Similarly, states with stronger union movements, like New York for example, tend to have more expansive workplace regulations, higher minimum wages, and better worker benefits than right-to-work states like Florida. A state's demographic makeup, including factors like age, race, socioeconomic status, rural-urban divides, and so on, can influence policy preferences. States like Florida, which have larger retired populations, tend to spend less on education and more on Medicare, long-term care, and senior services than states with smaller retired populations. The economic base of a state can also influence policy needs and priorities. Alaska, for example, has extensive oil and natural gas wealth. As a result, state policies favor extraction, and the money earned from that industry is used by the state to pay for most state spending. Similarly, agriculture-dominated states like Iowa and Nebraska lead those states to develop policies that emphasize water rights and management, land use regulation, and support agricultural technologies and markets. States like Florida and Hawaii, where tourism plays a key economic role, tend to invest in infrastructure like highways and airports that support that industry. And California's economy is significantly driven by high-tech research and innovation, especially in Silicon Valley. Consequently, the state's policies support R&D, tech startups, venture capital financing, and educational policies that emphasize STEM fields to foster a skilled workforce for the tech sector. And finally, historical events and traditions can have a lasting impact on state policies. For example, the historical strength of the labor movement in states with a significant manufacturing and automotive industry, such as Michigan and Ohio, has shaped their policies on labor rights, minimum wage, and unionization. These states have a tradition of strong labor unions, which continue to influence political forces advocating for worker protections, benefits, and wages, and contributing to ongoing policy discussions related to labor laws and economic development strategies. Similarly, the history of immigration, particularly from Latin America, has had a lasting impact on states like Texas and California. This history influences current policies on immigration, bilingual education, and cultural diversity. The rich multicultural heritage shapes these states' approaches to issues like language access in public services, support for immigrant communities, and cross-border economic policies. But that's it for now. Please leave any questions you have in the comments section below, and thanks for watching.